Hi, I'm Tom Balliol, a member of the first UU ASH group, the Atheists, Skeptics, and Humanists. And earlier this week, we had a presentation on viruses, vaccines, and vaccination. And I helped with that presentation along with Dr. Alice Farina, and we're going to reprise that for you today. I'm going to start with a little bit of background on viruses, and then Alice will take us further into the COVID virus specifically and some of the things we've learned about it and some of the things that we need to know in order to get as many people as possible vaccinated. So without any further ado, I'm going to share a screen. There we go. So let's take a little look at viruses. Starting off with the obligatory cartoon of the characters in the wonderful cartoon series Foxtrot, Jason and his brother Peter saying, "What you looking at?" "Well, viral videos." "Oh, you mean like Star Wars Kid and the Numa one?" "Electron microscope analysis of a human picornavirus." "Oh, we must get different emails." "See how the capsid is icosahedral in shape?" Which of course brings up the question, what does all that mean? And what is a virus? Well, basically a virus is just a strand of genetic material. It can be either a piece of RNA or a piece of DNA inside a protein shell. And there may also occasionally, depending on the virus, be a lipid membrane, an oily membrane present, and that surrounds the genetic material. The COVID viruses have a core of RNA, and that makes them a little bit more susceptible, or a lot more susceptible, to mutations than if it was a DNA-based virus. And that's important, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Are viruses alive? Well, as you can see, the jury is still out on that one, partly because the world of science doesn't really have a consensus view on what constitutes life versus non-life. Clearly, viruses reproduce themselves, but they require another organism's cells to do it. They don't take in food. They don't have respiration, things like that, that other living organisms do. So it's really a question as to whether or not they are truly alive, but they're everywhere. Most viruses are really, really small, much smaller than bacteria, much, much smaller than the individual cells in your body. Viruses outnumber cellular life by at least 10 to 1, giving viruses the greatest biodiversity on the planet. And we regularly eat and breathe billions of virus particles. We live in a sea of viruses. They're everywhere around us, in us, and on us. And even in our own genomes, we carry pieces of viral genetic material. Harmful viruses are kept in check by our immune systems. The COVID-19 disease is caused by a coronavirus. Coronaviruses tend to be spherical, and they've got these spiky proteins all around the outside of the spherical shape, as in a crown, hence the name corona. And the official name of the COVID-19 virus is SARS-CoV-2, standing for Sudden Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus, and it's the second one of that type that's been discovered. You may recall a number of years ago in China, there was an outbreak of SARS as a viral infection that was caused a lot of problems, a lot of concern, and then has been finally put to rest with vaccines and proper public health measures. So, but now we have the second variation, SARS-CoV-2. Coronaviruses as a group have been around for a long time. We've probably experienced the coronaviruses in the form of colds. About, I think, a quarter of all colds are from different strains of coronaviruses. The COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 virus is called a novel virus in that it has never before infected humans, and we have no natural immunities to it. The same way we have natural immunities to colds, we have natural immunities to flus, because we've been exposed to variants of those diseases in the past. For COVID-19, this is not the case. Okay, vaccines, basically, traditionally, vaccines were developed by taking a virus and making it inactive in different ways, heating it, whatever, using the killed viruses then to develop the vaccine, or taking a piece of the virus and reproducing it and creating doses of a vaccine that way. And this is how, well, some of the earliest vaccines that were ever developed, like for smallpox, used live or but diminished organisms or killed viruses to cause an immune response in the body. More recently, with the COVID virus, we have vaccines that are being developed by taking part of the virus's genetic code, part of its RNA, and using that to transmit a protein to those outer spike proteins on the virus to basically inactivate the whole virus and allow the body to then develop an immune response to them. And so companies like Moderna and Pfizer have used this new technique of just RNA segments. And then there's the Sputnik virus that's been in the news in the past couple of days, also uses pieces of the actual virus to develop its vaccine and its immune response. A question a lot of people ask is, well, gee, wasn't this vaccine developed really fast? And the answer is yes and no. The National Institutes of Health created a vaccine evaluation clinic over 20 years ago to look at new types of vaccines. And these types of, that we're seeing, the RNA-based vaccines have been studied since 2008. And then when the SARS virus arose in China and the MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome virus, became an issue across the Middle East, and they're both coronaviruses, they became targets for intense vaccine research, and vaccines were developed for both, and that was 7 years ago. And so building on this, once China released the full genome for the COVID-19 virus, these companies, Moderna, Pfizer, Oxford University, other teams that were looking to create vaccines, already had basically the platform, the structure on which to just make slight modifications, and were able to then very quickly get vaccines available to begin human testing. And so the other thing that really made the vaccine development happen as quickly as it did was the federal government pumped billions of dollars into the programs for getting these the testing going. For traditional vaccines like flu vaccines, the companies themselves have to underwrite the testing programs, and that's why they spread out in time more. because it's a cash flow issue. And in this case, we could just throw money at it and go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 more rapidly than for other vaccine development. And if you want to read more about it, here's a great web page that's basically an introductory course into virology, everything you ever wanted to know about viruses and probably more. And I found it very useful when developing this presentation. And now I'd like to turn things over to Alice to carry this on and get into some of the other questions that we've been dealing with.
Thanks, Tom. I particularly enjoyed that thing about the speed in which it was developed, and I will allude to that later. I'm Alice Farina. I'm a retired physician, but I still subscribe to medical journals, and I can tell you for the past year, all of the issues that I get from two journals that I read all have at least 1 or 2 articles about COVID, and some issues are entirely devoted to the subject. So I've had plenty of reading material, some of which I understand and some of it is over my head, but I have picked out of those journals things that I think are relevant to what we're discussing today. I happen to live in a retirement village. We are a high-risk facility because there is a nursing home, a dementia unit, an assisted living unit, so that we have many elderly, frail people here. That put us into the first priority list to get the vaccines when they became available in Ohio. And fortunately, they decided they would give them to everyone in the village. So I am looking forward to my second vaccination in a couple of days. I don't know of any residents who refused to get the vaccine, but we were told a couple of weeks ago that up to 50% of our staff and employees did not want to get the vaccine. This was very upsetting to our residents because they come in close contact with these employees. So I prepared an article for our local newspaper about the most common objections, which I will share with you later. But first, I want to talk about why pandemics and other major events lead to generate conspiracy theories. We've seen this before. Holocaust deniers, Apollo moon landing denied, 9/11 is thought to be an inside job, Obama was born in Kenya, Jack Kennedy was killed by the CIA, yada, yada, yada. There are estimates that up to 50% of Americans believe in at least one or more of these ideas. For example, more conservatives than liberals tend to believe that Obama was not born in the United States. Some liberals do indeed believe that 9/11 was a government plot to facilitate the invasion of Iraq. So there's some brain science that explains a lot of this. We are Homo sapiens, a wise man, but we're not really any wiser than the Neanderthals with whom we share a lot of genetic material. The original hunter-gatherers had brains that were attuned to pay attention to the environment, especially threats to their survival. So natural selection favors a conspiratorial or tribal mindset in which strangers or beings perceived as others are seen as potential or real threats. Our brains also classify information according to a number of biases that feed into creating explanations of disturbing events. The proportionality bias tells us that a major event arises from a major cause. That's not always true. The intentionality bias leads us to conclude that a major event was planned, not random. The confirmation bias, now widely augmented by social media, makes us look for evidence that reinforces an original belief or suspicion. And finally, there is the illusion of understanding bias in which we overestimate our knowledge of how things work. So let's move on now to beliefs about vaccines and vaccinations. You've heard about anti-vaxxers, right? This is not a new phenomenon. When smallpox immunizations were introduced 120 years ago, there was an immediate resistance. In the town of Leicester in the UK, many anti-vaccine rallies were organized. A local paper reported that one rally was preceded by a banner to escort a young mother and two men, all of whom had resolved to go to prison rather than have their children vaccinated. A demonstration in March of 1885 in the same community was attended by 80 to 100,000 anti-vaxxers, complete with banners, a child's coffin, and an effigy of Edward Jenner, who was the original smallpox scientist that got the whole immunization thing started. So let's fast forward to now. In 1998, a British physician, Andrew Wakefield, called for further investigations of a possible relationship between bowel disease and autism with a mumps, measles, rubella vaccine. He alleged the vaccine was not properly tested. The media inflated these stories, igniting public fear over the safety of the vaccine. The Lancet, which was the very respected journal that originally published his work, later stated in 2004 that they should not have published that paper, and in 2010 formally retracted it. Later, Wakefield was disqualified from medical practice for falsifying testing results and conflicts of interest. But he is alive and well and apparently spreading misinformation about COVID. The anti-vaxxers are alive and well in the United States. They are well organized and often have meetings at which they distribute publications asserting a number of things. One is that vaccines are toxic and contain antifreeze, mercury, ether, aluminum, human aborted fetal tissue, antibiotics, and other dangerous chemicals. Vaccines are a tool of big pharma, and individuals who promote them are merely profiting or being paid off by the pharmaceutical companies and to the harm of our children. A third is that a child's immune system is too immature to handle vaccines. They are given too many, too fast, and too often. The immune system has become overwhelmed, leading to autism and an assortment of chronic health conditions. A fourth ploy is that natural immunity is better. And you've probably read a lot about herd immunity, which is the term applied to immunity that you get from getting the disease rather than getting the vaccine. Alleging that most vaccine preventable diseases are harmless to most children and natural exposure provides a longer lasting immunity. Fifth, diseases that used to do in large segments of our populations have declined on their own due to improved hygiene and sanitation, and that immunizations are not an integral part of that. Finally, vaccines, when administered, expose you to the infection itself and therefore possibility of disease. So I'm going to show you some slides now. Let me get my slides in order here. That show up, Tom? Okay. The first set of slides was prepared in response to the resistance of our employees and staff to get a vaccine to address some of the concerns they raised. And because many of our employees are young people, a major concern they had was that the vaccines cause infertility or miscarriage. The science as reported by, for example, the American Society of Obstetrics and Gynecology, in fact, does not show that there has been an increased miscarriage rate in women infected with COVID-19. The antibodies that are in the vaccine are directed to the spike protein. The spike protein is what makes it possible for the virus to enter a cell, and it has not been linked to infertility after COVID-19 infection. And during natural infection, the immune system generates the same antibodies to the spike protein that the vaccines do. So this disinformation is thought to have originated from an internet postings by a former scientist known to be an anti-vaxxer. The COVID vaccine is not safe because it was rapidly developed and tested. Well, I think Tom addressed that in his remarks. The research on this really began decades ago, using a novel technique which is based on the molecular structure of the virus, not the entire virus. The prior vaccines, like the ones to polio and smallpox and even influenza, took years to develop because they were using an entire microbe. It might have been live, it might have been inactivated, but they had to be raised in tissue culture, which takes a long time. And so it took often 2 to 3 years for those vaccines to develop. There's a Hungarian refugee who came to the United States and started her research on messenger RNA about 2 decades ago. And in 2005, she found a method to prevent a severe inflammatory response, which would make vaccines dangerous. By finding a method to make sure this didn't happen, it paved the way for the development of novel vaccines, and the pharmaceutical companies who were already involved in research really hopped on it, and that's why we got the vaccine. This particular one does not contain all those contaminants and things like animal protein, human fetal tissue, and so forth, because it is a cell-free process without preservatives. You cannot get the COVID-19 infection from the viruses, from the vaccines, because it was made from a molecular fragment, not the live virus or the potentially live virus. There were no shortcuts. I personally think that the phrase Operation Warp Speed contributed to this fear of that this vaccine was brought out too quickly. Warp Speed set up a process for funding the manufacture and distribution, not the development of the vaccine. Let's see, why am I having a problem here? More people will die as a result of a negative side effect to the COVID vaccine than would actually die from the virus. Well, let's do some arithmetic here. COVID-19 mortality rate is estimated to be 1 or 2%. So people look at that number and say, well, that's a very high survival rate. Why would I need a vaccine? Well, that's really not the conclusion you should draw. A 1% mortality rate is 10 times more lethal than the seasonal flu. And the mortality rate varies widely, and it's influenced by age, sex, and underlying health condition. So let's do some more arithmetic. The US population is about 330 million. With a 1 to 2% mortality rate, let's take the 1% one, that's 3.3 million deaths. And we are close to 500,000 already. Herd immunity requires that at least 70% of the population must become infected. That's 231 million people, with 2.3 million deaths resulting if we do nothing to intervene. This is a little outdated. As of January 24th, over 20 million shots had been given. I have some more better information than that later on. I think we're up at 23 million shots have been given by now. Tom alluded to this. The COVID-19 vaccine will alter my DNA. DNA and RNA are related. They're both nucleic acids. DNA means double-stranded, contains individual genes, and each gene carries a recipe for creating a specific protein. It determines whether you have blue eyes, whether you have normal hemoglobin, whether you have sickle cell hemoglobin. Each gene relates to one particular trait. The DNA does not create these traits. What it does is it creates RNA, which carries the recipe out to the cells, and depending on which cell is responsible for doing that, the islet cells in the pancreas, for example, make your insulin. That's where that genetic message is carried out. So the vaccines work by instructing the cells in the body to make a protein that triggers an immune response. So injecting mRNA into your body will not interact with the DNA of your cells. the pathway is DNA to RNA. There is no pathway from RNA to DNA. Here are a couple of other questions that we, in our original presentation, noticed. And let me get this over here. Will the current vaccines protect against the variants that are emerging? And if you're reading the newspapers or watching TV, there's a lot of chatter about this. The antibodies produced in the vaccines that are currently being administered target several different sites on the protein. Here's a picture of, let's say, an antigen that you want to create a vaccine against, in this case, the spike protein of COVID-19. These funny shaped orange and black things are immunoglobulin molecules. They look like little pitchforks. And what happens is, as the antibodies develop, the interior of these things that look like jaws are able to connect with and fix onto specific areas on the antigen. And by doing that, they make them unable to carry out their activities. So Moderna reports that its vaccine is effective against the variant in the United Kingdom. The latest information I have is the variant from Africa, which has just recently reached our shores. I think Minnesota and a state down in the south someplace may be less responsive to the vaccine. Can those who have cancer or are immunocompromised or taking immunosuppressive drugs safely take the vaccine? Well, it's safe for them to take it. The problem is if you are immunocompromised, by definition, you have trouble mounting an effective response. For example, there's a hereditary condition called agammaglobulinemia. Gamma globulins is the fraction of your protein that antibodies are made in. If you can't make gamma globulin, you can't make antibodies. So while it might be safe to take them, it would probably not be worthwhile. Here's another one that I found interesting. Can my second shot be from another type of vaccine? In other words, I'm getting the Pfizer vaccine. If they run out of the Pfizer vaccine, can I get my second shot from Moderna? A very sensible question. We don't know if that's wise, say the medical experts. The UK will allow interchanging the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines because they're made by the same technology, basically. But the preference in the United States is to stay with one type. So I thought I had another slide here, but I'm not seeing it. Okay, Tom, I think I am pretty much done with the questions that I received. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I believe you did some research on the questions we got with our original presentation. You want to bring us up to date on those?
Okay. Yeah, we had a few questions that came up when we first gave this presentation, and probably a good idea to go through them with anybody who's new to what we've been talking about. First question, and I'll kind of hand it to you, Alice, to answer, is, will immunity be permanent after I get my vaccine?
That's a great question. The original vaccines like smallpox and polio and measles and so forth, they did not require a booster shot. And the reason probably is because they don't mutate rapidly. So once you got the vaccine, you were probably good for life. Those of us who got the smallpox vaccination who still have the little, you have a scar on your arm, Tom?
Yeah, well, and I actually got a second vaccine when I was in the Peace Corps.
Yeah.
And it was part of the smallpox eradication program. But
well, that vaccine was so effective that with a worldwide effort, smallpox has disappeared from the planet. The only place the smallpox virus exists that we know of is in test tubes kept under close surveillance and lock and key in cabinets in countries not always friendly to us. So if that virus ever got out, we have a whole generation of people who are vulnerable to it. So we got pretty much lifelong immunity to those. The reason we don't have lifelong immunity to things like the coronavirus is they mutate rapidly. You've all had colds and you get recurrent colds. The reason is you are probably immune for life from the original cold that you got from the original coronavirus from which you got it. But every season it mutates. So there's a new coronavirus that causes colds. And so you get another cold. So the answer is there lifelong immunity? I would say there's a strong probability, but the problem is that the dominant strain may not be the one that you have the immunity to.
Okay. You had mentioned about the other virus variants that are being discovered, the UK variant, the South Africa variant. I think there's also one from Brazil now that's got some people concerned. And will the vaccines that we're getting now be effective against these new variants?
Well, only time will tell, because by definition they're new, and it looks as if the pharmaceutical companies are testing the new variants as they come along. I think the one that they're only concerned about right now is the African variant. The answer to that problem is to end the pandemic as quickly as possible.
Which brings up the...
So that there aren't new variants coming out.
Yeah, which brings up a question is, how do we know when the pandemic is over? How do we know when we're back to normal?
Well,
you'd mentioned earlier that it's when we get that herd immunity upwards of 80% of the population. At least the COVID-19 pandemic, we can lay to rest pretty much at that point. But as we pointed out, this is a virus that's global, and with billions of people out there either having had it or susceptible to it or currently carrying it, that's an awful lot of potential for new variants, new mutations to arise. So hopefully we can say that we're done with it, at the end of our vaccination cycle, but COVID itself may be around, from here on out, and we have
coronaviruses are always going to be with us. So the possibility for a pandemic is always going to be there. And I think Bill Gates who is a computer nerd, has made health one of his primary issues in his retirement. And he was one of the ones who originally warned us about pandemics. But getting back to when can we expect this one to come to an end, I'll go back to the numbers I gave you. 70% people immune means that we've got to have 230 million people who either had the infection or got an immunization. I checked the numbers today. Our status as of January 29 is that in the United States, 27.3 million shots have been administered. 27.3. That's a little over 10% of our population. So we've got a ways to go to get to herd immunity. In Ohio, 6% of our population has gotten shots. The number who have gotten 2 shots is less than 1%. So again, we have a long way to go to get to the point where the amount of virus circulating in the air that we breathe goes down to virtually 0.
So the key to getting back to what we might think of as normal is really to get as many people vaccinated as possible, which brings up the question about how do we talk to people who are hesitant about getting vaccinated? This seems to be an issue. Well, you pointed out earlier the number of people who are against vaccines of any kind. and then the specific questions about, the COVID vaccine itself. But how do we talk to people and maybe ease the concerns they've got and have them more willing to get vaccinated?
Well, I think first of all, you need to know who you're talking to. If you have ever been at a meeting where anti-vaxxers have a table, these folks are passionate. Their mission is to convince you. You are not going to convince them. So if you know that's who you're talking to, give it up and find something more productive to do with your time. Similarly, if some small segment of our population have mental disorders, they have fixed delusions. They're able to function in society, work, do things. But if they have a fixed idea about this, you're not going to change their mind. So you can usually tell that pretty quickly in the conversation. If you are talking with someone who you estimate is really willing to engage in a conversation, I would follow the advice of Brian Southwell from Duke University School of Medicine, who wrote an article for physicians on how physicians should talk to their patients who have questions about the advisability of a vaccine. And I think his advice could be used by everyone. He says, use empathy and compassion. When you start the conversation, listen to them, inquire as to how they came to their beliefs and what their concerns are. And only then can you respond with how you came to your beliefs and what they are.
That's good advice. And I think people can use some of the information that they've received in this presentation. I know I had a conversation in a checkout line, and the cashier, who was elderly, I talked to her about the likelihood that we would both be eligible for vaccines in the immediate future. And she was very hesitant because she thought the whole process of producing the vaccine had been rushed. So I was able to allay that concern by pointing out what I did in my part of the presentation about how long these vaccines, especially the mRNA style vaccines, have been under development, and that the process, no steps were skipped at all, and that the process worked because the companies were ready to produce these vaccines and get right into testing. So at the end of that conversation, she seemed much more relaxed and at ease with the whole idea of getting vaccinated. So I think it can work. And I think, some of these tips are ways to go with talking to people.
There's something that I didn't bring up, and I probably should have, is reactions to the vaccine. I know that when I signed up to get my vaccine here at First Community Village, one of the things they inquired about was reactions to drugs and allergic reactions. So in looking that up, I'm reading here from an article. After a reported almost 2 million first doses of the Pfizer vaccine, they identified 21 cases that fit the definition for anaphylaxis. This is an allergic reaction that is immediate and severe and could be life-threatening, and it's the kind of reaction that some people carry EpiPens if they know they're allergic to bee stings or other types of antigens. So of those 21 people who had an immediate reaction that was severe, 19% were hospitalized. 4 patients were hospitalized, including 3 in the intensive care, and 17 were treated in an emergency room, but no deaths were reported. That's because they were able to treat the anaphylaxis. So there is a possibility of an allergic reaction. Most allergic reactions will be in the form of a rash or something that's not life-threatening. So yes, there can be some severe reactions to the vaccine. They are very, very small. An article I read today indicated that in the trials, some people worry about neurologic reactions, Bell's palsy, which is a facial nerve paralysis, which usually is temporary but can be permanent. It did not occur in any higher frequency in the test people than in the untested people, the placebo people. So yes, there can be reactions. Anytime you do any kind of a medical intervention, there's a chance for a bad result. But the frequency of those seems to be quite small.
Yeah. And I can report, with the group of seniors that I gather with by Zoom weekly, a number of them have had their first vaccination shots and several have had their second dose. And they report that the strongest reaction that any of them had, and we're talking people age 70 to 90, is a slight soreness around the site of the injection, which happens pretty much anytime you get an injection of anything. So I think that's...
If you have a history of allergy, you should make that very clear to the people who are going to be administering the vaccine so they can double check and make sure that it is safe for you to get it.
Yeah. So I think, that's pretty much our presentation. And, we really encourage everybody out there, as soon as you are eligible to get scheduled for a vaccine, to please do it. It's the only way we're going to get through this crisis. And, work to, get your family, your friends, your coworkers also in line to be vaccinated. So I'm going to stop the recording at this point